Yep, good to go.
Okay. All right, so here we go. Crayfishes, diversity, threats, and conservation in Maryland. Okay, so just to give you a little bit of background of crawdads, crayfishes, mud bugs. Bronwyn talked about I think they're called different things across the country, across the world. I think most of the crayfish scientists that are doing the work on them call them crayfishes, but of course you go regionally. I think up northeast they call them crayfish. As you move south, they call them crawdads, crawfishes, and mud bugs. It just varies as you go along, but for today we're going to call them crayfish. And they've been, as you know, probably, I mean, they've been studied for they've been studied for centuries. I remember dissecting one. I want to say it was in middle school, but it might have been early high school. But it's been a group of animals that have been studied for anatomy, physiology, animal behavior for a long time, and more recently for studies in invasive biology and conservation biology. So it's these have been a focus of research, scientific research for a long time. I have to throw this in here because it's kind of cool. I'm a bird nerd, and I'm a crayfish nerd, and I'm a fish nerd. So, but John James Audubon in his Birds of America, on his plate in his drawing, his painting for white ibis, which is, by the way, is one of my favorite birds. He painted mud bugs, crawdads, crayfish in the painting, and also their burrows, their chimneys, their mud chimneys that they create. Some species create, because while he was studying them, watching them, he noticed that they were using their long beaks to go down into the burrows, down into the chimneys to catch these crayfish to eat them. And so it's just a cool thing. And I just want to say that I'm such a nerd that I have a big print of this in my foyer in my house right now because I like white ibis, and I like crawdads. So there you go. But Audubon recognized it was an important food source for these birds. Okay, so crayfish are decapods, much like lobsters, shrimp, crabs. They throughout the world. They're distributed throughout most of the world in 3 families. And the most diverse family of the crawdads is Cambaridae here in North America, where the highest diversity is. They're native to all continents in the world except for Africa and Antarctica, but I have read fairly recent reports, that they have been introduced to Africa, unfortunately. But they are the largest mobile freshwater invertebrates in the world. They can weigh up to 10 pounds. Now, that doesn't happen here in North America. That happens down in Australia. Some of you might have heard of the yabbies, which is that picture up on the upper right. They get enormous. I hope someday I get to see one of those live. I have not yet had that experience, but pretty amazing. And here in North America is where crayfish diversity is the highest. We have the highest amount of species, most of which are in the family Cambaridae, and like a lot of our freshwater diversity, Maryland is okay, considering considering our size, which is small. We have a reasonable diversity, but as you move to the southeast into the Gulf states and south to the Gulf of Mexico, that's where the diversity is highest. Alabama, Louisiana, Mississippi, they have an enormous diversity of crayfish species. And so, yeah, so we harbor the world's highest diversity in this group of animals. Here's just a schematic of crayfish morphology. I think most of us probably caught these when we were kids in streams, just having fun or using them for fishing or whatever. So we're probably familiar. So, it looks like a small lobster. They're very much related. Uh, the the um, the head, everything. So they're comprised of the cephalothorax towards the anterior part of the body, and then the tail is the abdomen, and they have 10 legs. They're decapods, and so the paired 5 legs of the cephalothorax. The first pair of walking legs are called periopods. They're the claws, the chelae they call them. So they're the largest. They're the ones they use to defend, to catch prey, and so forth. And then the 2 paired legs behind the chelae do have pincers, and they use those for manipulating prey and manipulating substrate and so forth. They also have 5 pairs of swimmerets, technically called pleopods, on their abdomen. Um, these are used by the females to attach their eggs and to aerate their eggs and keep them clean of sediment, and just keep oxygen moving around the eggs. They're also modified in the male. The first 2 pairs of swimmerets, just below the cephalothorax, are modified in the males to become what we call gonopods, which is the sperm transferring organs, appendages, for reproduction. Now, those happen to be pretty important for crayfish taxonomy and identification. And although there are a number of characters, there's a lot of characters, especially in Maryland. There are characteristics of the rostrum, the head of the crayfish, the various parts of the cephalothorax, and characteristics of the cephalothorax. There are a lot of other characters you can use to identify differentiate between species of crayfish, but most of the crayfish keys, if you go out there and you look in the literature, crayfishes of Virginia, crayfishes of New York, and so forth, most of them rely on the differentiation of the modified male swimmeret, which is the gonopod, and they come in various shapes and forms, as you can see here, that by genera, Faxonius versus Cambarus versus Procambarus. They look very different, and those are, especially in areas where species are really hard to differentiate because they're so closely related. These structures, the gonopods, are what scientists, taxonomists for years have used to differentiate and describe species. Crayfish reproduction is a little weird. It's kind of cool. They have a lifespan of 3 to 5 years. Now, this will vary between species, and we really don't know much about lifespan of these species, but it's generally probably 3 to 5 years. They can reach sexual maturity by the end of the first year, but they exhibit something called cyclic dimorphism, where they molt, just like crabs molt and other crustaceans. They basically, in September, they will molt into a what is called form 1, which is a sexually ready stage of the male, and the gonopod and other features will become more distinct, and they're ready to go. I've read recent literature that the females undergo something similar. It's just not as readily apparent, but the male, when they molt into form 1, their gonopod gets more distinct, and that's what's used to again to describe or distinguish a lot of species, and what's used in a lot of species descriptions as a characteristic that makes it that species distinct. And that they're in that form from September to maybe April, May, and then they molt again into what's called form 2, and they become non-sexually active basically, and the gonopod takes on a different, just not distinct form. And so that's kind of the cycle that they go through for the 3 to 5 years or so that they live. All right, crayfish reproduction. Here is a picture of I believe it's a rusty crayfish couple. The male tends to grab the female, flip her over, and pin using his chelae on her chelae, kind of pin her down, and deposits sperm in what is called the annulus ventralis, which is located between her third and fourth, or towards the abdomen, but under her walking legs, and that's where the sperm is stored. And she stores that, and then fertilization occurs at the time of extrusion from the oviduct. I'll show you that in a second. Most species are highly fecund, so they produce a lot of eggs, each female. And here's a picture of, so what happens is she stores in that upper left-hand picture, if you can see it, you can see her annulus ventralis between her third and fourth. Is that right? Am I right? No, fourth and fifth walking leg right there. That's where she stored the male sperm, and then her oviducts are underneath her third, the paired legs of her third, her third walking legs, peripods, and what she does is exude the eggs, rolls them over the annulus ventralis, and where they're fertilized, and then attaches them to her swimmerets, as you can see there in that picture, where they excrete a substance called glaire, and it's just a sticky substance that attaches the eggs to the swimmerets under the abdomen. And she does that, and then she mostly goes into hiding in a burrow or just somewhere safe, and she fans those with her swimmerets and keeps that oxygen going and sediment free of those eggs until they hatch, and it varies, but if it's regular temperatures and all, a couple weeks, and then the larvae, the juveniles, basically they hatch out of those eggs, and they look basically just like a normal crayfish, but just really, really small, and they take their chelae, their claws, and they attach to her swimmeret, and they hang there for a few weeks, and she walks around with them and protects them, and she feeds and gets them food until they get large enough to break free and live on their own. And there is a time, which is kind of funny, there is a time where at first mommy's being nice and giving them food and protecting them, but then they get large enough, and then mommy starts to look at them like they're actually food. So there's a fine line there where the young are great, and then it's like, okay, mommy's not our friend anymore, I got to get out of here. So so that happens. But and so I've caught crayfish in the upper left there, what they call in berry, and then I've caught many crayfish that have the juveniles hanging on the swimmerets, and it's pretty interesting reproductive style. Okay, in terms of crayfish habitat, most surface waters in Maryland, freshwater surface waters, have crayfish. Streams, rivers, lakes, of course, vernal pools, Delmarva bays, swamps, roadside ditches have crayfish. I mean, pretty much wherever anytime you're in a swamp or even tidal freshwater, you can find crayfish. crayfish, some species are surprisingly tolerant of salt, and even in the Susquehanna Flats, a lot of eel watermen that collect, have eel pots out there and are commercially harvesting eels. They'll catch crayfish out there. Now it's low salinity. It's like 0 to 3 to maybe 5 on a summer day, but 5 parts per thousand. But still, they're out there in tidal water. And some of the species with lab studies, they're more tolerant of salt than you would expect. But most surface waters in Maryland, the potential for crayfish is there. But there are a number of species that have that don't have any connection to that. They don't care about surface water. They live underground. They live in the water table, in the groundwater, and we call these burrowers. And they make some species across the country make a really elaborate burrows. They can be really deep. That's a picture of me on the right, down in South Carolina, in the middle of there's not surface water anywhere in sight. And I went down probably 4 or 5 feet and caught the crayfish out of that burrow. They're pretty amazing critters. But if you've ever walked in a floodplain in Maryland and seen in the middle picture there, those little elaborate mud chimneys made out of little mud balls, that's made by a crayfish. And what's cool about it is during the winter, those burrowing crayfish will cap those chimneys off, to shield them from the temperature, and then they will spend the entire winter down in the water table in a cavity that they create, and they sit in that water. So again, these species, some of them don't even need surface water at all. They come out during rainstorms and feed, and they come out during rainstorms and find mates, and that's basically their surface time. So as far as the ecology, crayfish are pretty important in aquatic ecosystems. They've been called keystone species. They're habitat engineers. They move substrate around. They aerate the substrate. They tear down aquatic vegetation sometimes while they're feeding. They just alter the substrate and structure in streams and lakes and so forth. They're also like generalists, omnivores. They'll eat anything. They consume leaves, woody debris, algae, you name it. They would prefer protein, of course, and so but you'll find them, especially juvenile small crayfish, in leaf pack in streams, in like piles of leaves where all the other invertebrates are doing their thing, eating the leaves, which is the food base of the stream. Crayfish are in there eating the leaves and the inverts that are feeding on the leaves. So they're everywhere. They're also an important food source. A scientist a researcher out in Missouri did a lit search and found that over 200 species of fish, birds, mammals, and other critters consume crayfish. So they're an important food source throughout the ecosystem. And so as you might expect, as keystone species, changes in their populations, loss of them, changes in their species, changes in species and changes in abundance can potentially have profound effects on an ecosystem. And here's just an illustration of that. They're important for the breakdown of organic matter, leaves, woody debris, stuff like that. They consume algae, the paraphyte that grows on rocks, and they provide food and they for a number of organisms. Okay, so crayfishes of Maryland. Getting to the meat of the talk. We have really a few historical accounts of crayfishes through the years that have been really useful. Faxon in 1885. Probably one of the more important ones, Meredith and Schwartz, who did a pretty comprehensive look at the time of crayfish distribution and status in 1960. Schwartz et al. In 1963 was the first to describe a new introduced species in Maryland. And then more recently, the Maryland Biological Stream Survey, which I've worked for many years, started, we were out there surveying, and we started paying attention to the crawdads that we were catching. And since then, every site we sample across the state, and we sample 150 to 200 every year, we collect crayfish. We pay attention. What are we seeing? Burrows, or what crayfish are here? We identify them. We count them during our surveys, and so through the years, we've collected crayfish data from over 7,100 sites across the state. And here's what we found. So we have 9 native species in Maryland, and comprising 4 genera. And I've starred the ones that are, so the top 6 right there on the top of the list are primarily surface dwelling crayfish found in surface waters, lakes, and rivers and streams and so forth. And the bottom 3 are starred because they are primarily the ones that are building those mud chimneys, living underground for the most part of the year. Every now and then you can find them in streams, but it's rare. So they're the ones that are primarily the burrowers. In terms of their imperilment or status, the most imperiled species we have right now is a species that was up until a few years ago was always called a Cambarus acuminatus. It has now been there's been a lot of work on it, and that was a complex of species that extended from Pennsylvania down to South Carolina, including Maryland. And a bunch of work was done, genetics, morphometrics, and so forth. And now it's being divided into a number of, that complex that was acuminatus is now being divided into a number of species. And the one that's in Maryland has, because of it, once it's described, and hopefully it'll be described in the next 2 years or so, it is globally more rare than what it was originally. And it's only found in Maryland, in the Anacostia right now as we know it, Anacostia, portions of the Patuxent, and a portion in the James River, which is strange, but in James River in Virginia. So but it is by far the rarest crayfish we have in Maryland. The other ones are, some of them are what we consider species of GCN species that we need more work on, like Creaserinus euleri, Cambarus dubius, and more monitoring, more knowledge of their distribution. But they're not in any danger of disappearing as of right now. But some populations of these species have been affected amazingly by invasive crayfish, which I'll get into in a second. So that's why I say although most species are not imperiled, several species have declined regionally. So, and I'll get to that soon. All right, so I'm going to take you through maps and just a description real quick of the status of our native species. It's a lot to handle, a lot to take in. I just want to touch on our natives. And these maps this is straight out of our, we have a crayfish key, which I'll give you a link to at the end of this talk. It's on our DNR website, but I just want to give you just a kind of a general understanding of where these things are and what we have. So this is native species. So Procambarus acutus, white river crawfish, is mostly a coastal plain species. We find them very commonly on Delmarva and in southern Maryland. and on the coastal plain of the western shore of Chesapeake Bay. But there are weird populations that pop up. One is in Deep Creek Lake, kind of weird, probably introduced. But they are in a few streams out in Garrett County that it's strange. So I don't know how to explain that, but maybe introductions. But mostly this species is on the eastern shore, and it's relatively stable. Well, not relatively stable. I think very much stable as of now, but could be impacted by invasive species in the future. Moving to the genus Faxonius, we have two in our state. One is primarily, at least currently, from the Piedmont east to Delmarva, which is called the spiny cheek crayfish, Faxonius limosus. And then one that is primarily from the Piedmont west, like from basically Frederick west, is predominantly its distribution, and that's Faxonius obscurus Allegheny crayfish. Both of these species, especially the spiny cheek, has been impacted by invasive species that I'll get into in just a second, but they're both vulnerable. But that's so if you're in Western Maryland, you're more likely to encounter, especially in medium to larger streams, the Allegheny crayfish. In Eastern Maryland, you will encounter more often the spiny cheek. All right, moving to the genus Cambarus, we have the Cambarus bartoni, the common crayfish, which is very common in more headwater streams of central Maryland and west, on the Atlantic slope. Pretty common crayfish that you're going to encounter when you're hitting, especially headwaters. Though I have found them in the main stem Susquehanna, but that's rare. They mostly inhabit smaller streams in all of these watersheds. And its sister species is called Cambarus carina rostris, the rock crawfish, and that's its kind of sister species on the Gulf of like the Youghiogheny drainage, so the non-Atlantic slope. This is a species mostly in the Ohio drainage, and so we get this in the Youghiogheny and Castleman in far Garrett County is where you will encounter the species. And again, it's pretty stable. It's pretty common in the headwaters of those watersheds. So here's the species that I talked about that is the rarest and most imperiled crayfish that we have in the state. It's now called Cambarus species C, previously the acuminate crayfish. It was historically distributed throughout the fall line of Maryland, between the coastal plain and the Piedmont, from Washington, D.C. to Baltimore, but is now, as far as we know, mostly restricted to the Anacostia and portions of the Patuxent River watersheds. It has a very restricted distribution. It's going to be described here soon as a new species, not acuminate, but it'll have its own name, and it will, because of that description, it'll become globally more rare and certainly become possibly state threatened or even endangered. Unfortunately, it's in watersheds that are highly urbanized, but it hangs on. And are invaded by invasive crayfish, but I mean it's still there, and so a lot of work that needs to be done with this species. Here are two of the three burrowing crayfish, primary burrowing species that we have in Maryland. This is the top one is the devil crawfish. It's a beautiful crayfish. It's got beautiful claw. I mean, it's a really pretty crayfish, and it's really common. I mean, when you see those chimneys out there when you're hiking in floodplains or along streams, it's more than likely it's this species. Fairly easy to excavate from the burrows, and just a really cool crayfish. Really stable. Really no threats right now in terms of status. The upland burrowing crayfish at the bottom is a beautiful. It's like that's the color of them. They're amazing, and they're harder to collect. They have more complicated burrows. They're in the uplands. They're out in Western Maryland. They're a tough critter to catch, but they're beautiful when you catch them. And they're currently being listed as a species of greatest conservation need in terms of our recent state wildlife action plan. I wouldn't say they're in any danger of disappearing, but I think we need more information on their status and their distribution just so that we can monitor on them through time. And the last of the natives is Creaserinus euleri, digger crayfish. Again, a burrower. This is coastal plain. Again, makes the mud chimneys. Just rarer than the devil crawfish, the Cambarus diogenes, from the previous slide, but still, and this is one that is of greatest conservation need in the current state wildlife action plan because we just don't have any records, and part of it's because we're not targeting. Based on our stream survey, we're not really targeting the habitats that we need to in order to really understand this species might be far more widespread than we think, and the lack of records is probably just an artifact of our sampling. But very cool species, and being described now. So this was part of a complex as well, but its species description is almost finalized, and its, I think, type locality will be in Maryland, which is pretty cool. Okay, moving on. So that's the 9 native species. Moving on to crayfish conservation. This is a relatively old graphic put forth by the Nature Conservancy, looking at all faunal groups and floral groups across the country or North America. And I always I give talks to school groups and so forth, and I always ask them, what do you think when you think of endangered species? What do you think of? And everybody thinks of coral reefs and rainforests as terms of loss of biodiversity and most imperiled. And when we talk about most imperiled species, everybody says birds and elephants, those kind of things. But when you really look at it, the most imperiled groups of animals and plants, when compared, fall out as freshwater organisms across North America. And when this is done globally, this is the same. It's kind of the same pattern. So the top 4 in North America in terms of imperilment, proportion of imperilment, is freshwater mussels, followed by crayfish, followed by amphibians, followed by freshwater fishes. So crayfish are very much imperiled. So when you look at all those groups that I just showed you, when you dig into the literature and you look at causes for that imperilment, it usually goes, okay, habitat loss and degradation, followed by introduced invasive species. But for crayfish, it's really kind of the opposite. Now, I'm not saying habitat loss and degradation is not important, but when you look at imperilment of crayfishes across North America and across the world, it goes in. The number one cause is introduced invasive species, followed by habitat loss and degradation. And there you see a quote by David Lodge in 2000 that basically said that the greatest threat to crayfish diversity worldwide is the introduction of non-native crayfish. And so here is a list of what we have in Maryland right now in terms of introduced non-native species of crayfish. And some of these, I will say, are most definitely invasive. Some of them are introduced, and their invasiveness has yet to be determined. But looking at that list, there's 5, and we only have 9 natives. So 35% of Maryland species are non-native at this point in time. So why are crayfish why do they make such great invasive species? They have the life histories and the tolerance that make them amazing pioneers in terms of when they're released into a new environment, they can hang on, and they have just the right characteristics to take hold and reproduce. And here's the list of some of them. I, the rapid growth rates, produce large number of offspring, large body size and aggressive. When it comes to crayfish, large body size really matters. And for competition, for shelter, for prime feeding habitats, for prime shelter habitats, for just aggressiveness to other species, the larger the species, the larger the individual, at least, the more competitive you are in the crayfish world. So what are the consequences? Well, the loss of native biodiversity has been documented so much. When you introduce a non-native crayfish, typically invasive crayfish, native crayfish species abundance declines, and in some cases it happens very rapidly. And in what's called invasive displacement, native crayfish can be eliminated from entire watersheds, and that can happen very quickly. And based on some colleagues that have worked in Maryland years before I was working here, it can happen within 2 years in some circumstances. And this has been documented so widely. There's so much literature on this. I mean, I just listed some here in terms of documenting native displacement by invasive crayfishes. And many of these studies have looked into the mechanisms, and the mechanisms are many. There's not just competition, but hybridization, reproduction interference, disease. If you can get, if you're bigger, then you have a differential risk of predation than a native species, because you're bigger and you can defend yourself, and the native species is more vulnerable, etc. There's a lot of mechanisms that have been researched and hypothesized in terms of why this happens. It has happened in Maryland. So this species, viral crayfish, Faxonius virilis, was first documented in the 50s as introduced in the Patapsco River near Baltimore, probably as a food item, but that was just speculation. But it was first documented in the 50s, and in 1963, Frank Schwartz documented it throughout, and he noticed that the native species, Faxonius lamosus, had declined, which was the predominant crayfish in the river, had basically declined as this thing had spread. And so those yellow dots show where the first reported occurrences were, and there you can see the hash marks of the Patapsco River Basin, and there you can see the current range of viral crayfish as we know it in the central part of Maryland and west. And you can see that it's spread. Now, it's spread throughout the Patapsco, probably on its own, but it's hopped to different watersheds, and I'll get to this in a little while. But it is the most widespread invasive crayfish we have in the state right now, and it gets very large. It gets big. Okay, what effect has it had? And this is the probably the most apparent impact it's had. It has been on our native spiny cheek crayfish, which was the most predominant crayfish throughout the Piedmont, the Patapsco, and then beyond the Piedmont in Maryland historically. And based on our records and historical records, the spiny cheek distribution in Maryland has shrunk considerably as the viral crayfish has become more dominant throughout our central Maryland watersheds. And this is ongoing. I think maybe the saving grace for the spiny cheek is that it's spread throughout Delmarva, where viral crayfish has not been introduced. And I'm not sure what it is, but virile crayfish doesn't venture too much down into the coastal plain. So at least based on our record so far, I don't know the reason why, but maybe that's the saving grace for the spiny cheek crayfish. But just most of its population in Piedmont of Maryland, Central Maryland, Baltimore, Washington area, have declined considerably over time. And it still remains a significant threat to other species, the Allegheny crayfish and the acuminate crayfish around DC. So here's the most notorious crayfish of, if you dig into the literature of invasive crayfishes in North America, rusty crayfish is the most. It's the most notorious. It's native to portions of the Ohio around Cincinnati and Kentucky and that a small stretch of the Ohio down there, but it's been widely introduced mostly as live bait. It was first discovered in Maryland in 2007, probably coming south from Pennsylvania through the Monocacy, and it's been spreading in the Monocacy ever since downstream. We also found it in 2009, I believe, in the Antietam, and by then it had already reached the Potomac. And so this map doesn't necessarily do it justice in terms of its current distribution. It's definitely in the Potomac and spreading up and downstream. It is a notorious invader that has in terms of displacing native species, there's a lot of literature out there. In Maryland, we've noticed that it actually displaces the virile crayfish, the more widespread species of invasive. So it's a nasty invader. And it says may pose a disaster for native Orconectes. That was the old Faxonius. That bottom line of that slide is wrong. It says Orconectes. That was the original genus of rusty crayfish, but it's changed in the past couple of years, and I just didn't change it on the slide. So apologize for that. All right. Red swamp crayfish. This is the one, Bronwyn, this is the one everyone eats. This is the cultured crayfish of Louisiana and Mississippi and the Gulf states. It's good to eat. But it was brought up here in the 1960s by actually researchers at the Patuxent Wildlife Refuge, introduced into Cache Lake on the Patuxent Wildlife Refuge as for forage for wading birds or migrating birds. And of course that was a mistake. But it was also brought up here on a separate occasion by a farmer on the Eastern Shore who was looking to fill his farm pond, his irrigation pond, with something he could actually harvest and make money on. And for a brief time, they had a company or an association where they were they were basically Johnny Appleseeds spreading to other farmers, trying to create a crawdad aquaculture harvest industry in Maryland. And I think it largely died, probably because Marylanders eat crabs more so than they eat crawdads. But the damage was done once you introduced it. It spread to watersheds, and there you can see its current range. And it was probably also introduced at times here and there by through the aquarium pet trade where it's traded, and also through bait. So what's the big deal? Loss of native biodiversity. Does replacing one crayfish species with another one really make a difference? I mean, doesn't the ecosystem just go on? Maybe. I don't know. Does it really? I would say yes, because it's not replacing, and it didn't evolve in the system. So I mean, it's not replacing one with an equal. They're not ecological equivalents, and from what we've witnessed and what others in other states have witnessed is that a non-native species, invasive species, attains way higher densities for whatever reason. in introduced in environments. And it's impressive if you've ever walked through a stream and go up to the upper Monocacy. You'll see what I'm talking about. But if you've ever walked through a stream and watched crayfish dart from you, and you're like, wow, these are a lot of crayfish, that is a stream that's invaded by a non-native invasive species. Because I've never been in a stream where I'm like, oh my, look at all the native crayfish, because they're not as abundant. I mean, these invasive species really reach densities that are really astonishing. And there's reasons for it, of course. Lower predation risk. They can exploit different resources. They get larger, and so forth. But it's really astounding when you walk through a stream that's invaded by a non-native crayfish. And here, just to show you some of our data, this is kind of old data, but still relevant. 2007 and 2009 data on our stream survey, looking at the invasives versus the commons. You can see that most of the invasive crayfish reach far higher densities than our native fauna. And of course, if you're reaching those kinds of densities, you're consuming more of the energy that's flowing through that system, and that's less energy available to other native critters. And so it can have adverse changes. Those densities can have adverse changes to ecosystem function, integrity, energy flow, etc., up and down the ecosystem, up and down the food chain, and disrupt the flow of energy. And what has been documented in many papers and many research projects across the country is that invasive crayfishes decrease the leaf matter, detritus, everything that's good. Submerged plants, stream insects, inverts, freshwater mussels, snails, amphibians, while at the same time increasing suspended sediments and turbidity and things that are not so good for the rest of the stream community. We know that many fish eat crayfish. So would more crayfish result in more fish? And based on a angler bait survey we did years ago, the idea that dumping your bait is going to help the fish that are there and fatten them up for the next time you're going to fish is a pretty prevalent belief among our anglers community and so forth. So you would think, more crayfish, more fish, bigger fish, happier fish, but that's not the case. Research has shown that invasive crayfishes in lakes and especially around the Great Lakes, where a lot of this work was done, resulted in lower quality forage, reduced nursery habitats for young fish, reduced food items for juvenile fishes. So they have an impact on fishes that a negative impact that you wouldn't expect. And so literature has shown that fish growth has decreased, fish abundance, rare fishes have decreased, recreational fisheries have been impacted, to the point where local economy has been impacted because the recreational fishery has declined. And Keller in 2008 examined these impacts on the economies of the local economies of around lakes up north, and found that the declines in panfish resulted in less spending by anglers, to the point of $1.5 million per year in revenue loss for one county in Wisconsin. So there is recreational impacts resulting in economic impacts associated with crayfish introductions. So adverse changes to ecosystem function, integrity, energy flow, community structure, impacts to other fauna, recreational fisheries. Has this happened in Maryland? We don't know. We haven't done the research. We know that native crayfish are declining, but what other impacts are happening in the ecosystem? We haven't done the work. But given the density we've seen, the density that we've seen of these invasives where they are invaded, it's hard to imagine that other impacts to other aspects of the ecosystem have not occurred. So how do they get here? Vectors of introduction. Here are the big four that have been identified in terms of how native crayfish are being moved around throughout the world, not just in North America, not just in Maryland. Aquaculture, live bait, aquarium pet trade, and biological supply for schools and so forth. And so here, like looking at the likely vectors based on our work, in terms of for the 5 species that we have introduced into Maryland, live bait certainly falls out as the most likely of most of the species. Now, some of the red swamp crawfish, which is the one that is eaten most often in Louisiana and by all of us, that it's probably traded in everything. So the vector there is there are many, but most of the likely pathway of vectors for their introduction for the other 4 are live bait. And so how do we know this is so? Just looking at viral crayfish, going back to that one, the most widespread crayfish that we have in Maryland, they were first introduced in Patapsco, and look at the distribution now. That doesn't happen by its own dispersal, because it doesn't crawl over ridge tops to the next watershed, and they are carried by birds. I mean, this is happening, most likely, certainly by bait bucket introduction, the movement, the catch of crayfish in the Patapsco or wherever by an angler, going there in the morning, catching a bucket full of crawdads, driving 30 minutes or wherever to where you want to go fishing and using them as bait, and then at the end of the day dumping them into the water body where you were fishing. And we know this, we know that, I mean, this has been documented widely, by the way, but in Maryland, we did a survey in 2008 of anglers. We know that 20% of Maryland anglers at that time use crayfish as bait. Most of them catch their own, because, I mean, although some bait shops at that time sold them, most of them went out and caught them on their own. And I will say that if you're going to go out and catch crayfish, you're going to catch them where there's a lot of them. And when there's a lot of them, it's probably a place that has invasive crayfish, because, again, like I said, when you walk through a stream and you see a lot of crayfish, that's not a good sign. So based on a survey in Maryland bait shops in 2008, only at least 2 non-native species were sold. The good news is we just redid this survey in 2022, and at that time, and based on that survey, no bait shops were reported selling crayfish, and that is good news. But based on the 2008 numbers, 69% of anglers that use crayfish at that time released them live in the water. So basically, again, they catch them, they move them, they fish with them. Whatever they don't use, they release in the water, and that's how viral crayfish and a lot of these species have been spread over time. So is the worst behind us? Maybe. I don't know. Or a more invasive crayfish headed our way. And here you can see the time series. 1885, there were 0 non-native species in Maryland. 1960, there was 1, which was viral crayfish, and as of 2011, there were 5 total introduced crayfish in Maryland. Is the worst behind us? Maybe not. International trade's growing. We have a lot of crayfish in North America, so there's a lot that could be moved around if we're not careful. The challenge is preventing the further spread of the 5 species we already have established. That's a big challenge, like keeping them where they are, not helping them spread more. And also preventing other species from coming from out of state into our waters. As far as crayfish conservation, continuing monitoring to detect changes in native species status, detect new introductions of non-native species. We're doing a lot with our stream survey to do this. There's also a lot of citizen science folks, Maryland Biodiversity Project. There are people out there looking and identifying stuff. So, detecting, so increasing our ability to detect changes in native species and new introductions. In terms of non-native crayfish management, we have worked in the past with using various regulations to restrict invasive crayfish use as bait, limit import. There's a number of species that are banned from import. There are a number of species that are banned from, you're not allowed to move them. Enforcement is a big issue there, but there are regulations to try to limit the spread of our invasives. And really what it boils down to is just increasing public awareness and spreading the word and reinforcing, human behavior takes a long time to change. So, you can't just hear the message once. You got to kind of repeat it and repeat it and repeat it and explain why to people that don't dump your live bait, keep it, put it in your freezer, to dispose of it humanely. And so we've increased our efforts over the years with a variety of media to try to get the message out that this is a problem. Don't do it. Help us. And so that's ongoing. A third one I would say is protecting our streams, rivers, and wetlands, especially our high quality waters. There is evidence out there that the more disturbed a system is, more degraded, more vulnerable it is to invasion by invasive species. So if we can keep our waters and our high quality waters in good condition, the more resistant they will be to a potential introduction. And lastly, just in terms of crayfish conservation, and there's a lot of work being done and it's growing, but continue research on life history, population dynamics, impacts, etc., so that we better understand what we have and how we can protect it. And so this is just the last thing, I'd say, in 50 years from 2011, where we had a total of 5 introduced species, where will we be? How many natives will be at risk? Well, who knows? I hope we do a good job at changing this trend. For more information, guys, we have publications on our Maryland DNR, Maryland Biological Stream Survey website. We have aquatic species websites that has some fact sheets on some of these species. We have a stream health website that is great. It's an interactive map. You can zoom into every site that has been sampled by the MBSS in Maryland. You can go into your backyard and see if your stream has been sampled. You can click on the dot and it'll give you a list of everything that was collected there, the health of it based on water chemistry and physical habitat and the biology. And you can see what crayfish, if any, were collected there. So it's a really useful resource. I really encourage you to look it up. It's Maryland. If you just type in Maryland Stream Health website into Google or whatever, you will find it. It's a really good resource. We also have on our publications page a key to the Maryland crayfishes, which has a lot of the distribution maps and so forth that I put in this presentation tonight. Any questions?
All right, Jay, that was wonderful. Can you unshare?
Yes.
And we will open it up for questions. Here we go. I got a spotlight. I have a spotlight on you. Let's see. Go ahead and you can put your questions in the chat box, or you can raise your hand and I can call and you can ask directly. Let's see. Brian says, um, I think the biggest hurdle to this and regulations on is the public and their unwillingness to learn how to properly identify species that go along with any of the regulations. Just look at how many can't or don't want to identify sunfish species. Do you want to speak to that?
Is that in the chat? Where is that?
Yeah, it's in the chat.
All right, I'm looking. Hold on. I'm trying to catch up just so I can.
It's the last one in the chat.
Yeah, I mean, yeah, I agree that crayfish ID is difficult. And I think it's just a behavior thing. It's just like if you're using crayfish, whether you bought them in a store or hold on. Yeah. It's hard to rely on the public to properly identify if they're using them as bait, as in terms of, oh, this is a native species, I'm good. I think the reality is use them where you catch them where you use them. If you're using them as for fishing, and don't transport them. And if you do transport them, don't release them. Dispose of them humanely or back where you originally caught them. I think that, I mean, trying to teach the public how to identify crayfish that's not going to be good. I don't know if that does that answer your question? I don't know.
I'm not sure. Brian, put something in the chat box if that didn't answer your question. We had a lot of comments about why don't we just eat the invasives? Is there a way to catch them and eat them?
I
Get
think
rid
that,
of them.
yeah, I mean, I know we're using the eat the invasive mentality for blue catfish, trying to develop a commercial harvest and sustainable commercial fishery for blue catfish in the Chesapeake Bay. And it's still going and it's getting better, but it's been a struggle. The trouble with the crawdads is, it's a continual thing. You're not going to eat your way out of the problem, but you might reduce locally their population, but it has to be so sustained. Um, and I don't think we have the local interest in eating. And and a lot of these crayfish aren't very big, so you got it's a lot of effort to catch them. So I don't know if we're going to eat our way out of the problem, though it sounds romantic, but I think it has to be sustained through time, just like what they're trying to do with blue catfish. But yeah, they actually watermen like harvesting. I mean, if you were to go in the Monocacy, for instance, for the rusty crayfish, you would have to harvest and harvest and harvest and harvest and harvest through time, and it's a lot of effort to do that. And I don't know if there's enough people out there that want to eat them and invest, especially when they like to eat blue crabs that are this big. They want to eat dozens and dozens of relatively small crawdads. So I don't know if that's the answer.
Alan, you have your hand up.
Yes, and great presentation and thanks. And I probably shouldn't have been eating dinner during the reproductive part of the presentation. But two questions. One is when you talked about the impact on the fish populations and other things in the water ecosystem, just how were you able to separate out that it was the crawfish and not something else? And then my second is my standard question, unless I missed it at the beginning, which is how you got interested in working and studying around crawfish.
Can you state your first question again? I'm sorry.
So you showed like a list of like 5 or 6 detrimental things like reductions in fish and other kind of reductions in other healthy parts of the ecosystem. And it seemed like you were drawing the connection saying this was caused by, the invasive species, the invasive crayfish. But I'm wondering, how did you rule out other factors that might have, caused that reduction?
Yeah, a good question. Just to be clear, I was reporting basically on a mountain of literature that has studied invasive crayfish elsewhere. So that wasn't crayfish study in Maryland in terms of other impacts to fisheries and
Okay.
other things. But and so that that was a bunch. It's a ton of research out there looking at impacts of invasive crayfishes elsewhere. And so that was just kind of my summary of the results. And I'm presuming that they following the scientific process somehow ruled out other factors. But I mean, certainly there are other factors, but I hope they did their due diligence. Oh, and as far as getting interested in crayfish, to be honest, we did well, I mean, honestly, there was we collected as part of our stream survey back in 95 and 96 data. We were collecting, we were just basically taking crayfish and throwing them in jars and send them off to a guy at DNR, that worked at DNR at the time, to just try to figure out what these were. Like they weren't part of the survey at that time. And then that person identified them, and we started looking at those data, and we were like, wow, this is weird. And I'm going to be honest, it was a little selfish. There was no one doing crayfish in Maryland. And I was like, and so I saw an opportunity to fill a niche and run with it, and I kind of did. so
So that's
so
great.
and
I
I've
mean,
loved it ever since. So
yeah, and I didn't expect that, but so let me push you further back. How did you just get into the field itself, the whole field of doing this kind of work?
Good question. I went to Salisbury. It's funny. I went to Salisbury on a dual degree program with the University of Maryland Eastern Shore. Graduated, and I was working for one of my professors, and he got a job announcement from a guy named Linwood Hall out of University of Maryland Y Research Center, who had contracted with DNR at the time to do the stream survey work on the Eastern Shore, and I got that job. And I went from the kind of the marine world, where my background was in terms of my degree, into the freshwater world, and I went from there, and went to grad school, and came back to DNR, it was mostly on stream fish. My background's mostly stream fishes, but then got into crayfish kind of thing. So I've loved it for sure.
All right, I have a quick question. You mentioned that, we say that crayfish are mini lobsters. And then when you put the life cycle up and said that the crayfish typically lifespan is 3 to 5 years, where you hear the lobsters live much, 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 much longer. Um, is there any reason why there's such a shorter lifespan between the two?
That is a great question. I don't know the answer to that. I do know that I from reading now years ago that it's hypothesized that the freshwater crayfish were an invasion, evolved from invasion of a saltwater lobster. Like the evolution came from the salt up into the freshwater, and they evolved from that. As far as why the life cycle is so different, I don't even know if lobster have that cyclic molting pattern. I don't know. I don't know much about lobster, to be honest, but they're related, and it came from freshwater crayfish came from the sea, I guess, if that makes sense. It was an invasion of freshwater into freshwater by ancestral lobsters, and it evolved as I've read, as I remember, but don't quote me on that. But yeah, I don't know why it's so different. But you know, a lot of our freshwater fishes, our freshwater animals, not all of them, but a lot of them are fairly short-lived.
As compared to their saltwater brethren?
I think so. I mean, but I can't explain why that is. But you know, freshwater fishes, most of them probably have a 3 to 5 year lifespan. Crayfishes kind of average out that way. I don't know about other organisms, but yeah, I'm sorry I can't explain
No,
why the difference.
it's a question now. I'm gonna have to go down a not a rabbit hole, but a crawfish burrow and try to figure that one out. And speaking of burrows, I have never seen a crawfish, the chimneys, the crayfish chimneys in Maryland. Where would I find those? You- I mean, I have seen them in Louisiana and down south and things like that, but just I haven't seen them in Maryland.
Well, I think the floodplains of most rivers, streams and rivers, well, you know, even they seem to be more. The burrowing species seem to be more prevalent, especially the most common devil crawfish, Cambarus diogenes, is most prevalent on the coastal plain. They get up into Piedmont a little bit, but if you walk a floodplain of the Patuxent or the lower Gunpowder, especially on the eastern shore, you go down to southern Maryland. If you walk the floodplain, a wooded floodplain of near those streams, you'll see them.
And if they're on the eastern shore, is saltwater intrusion going to be a problem with the burrowing ones?
Maybe in areas close to those tidal marshes, but not at a not a risk right now in terms of risking their status.
All right. Any other questions? Well, you have more people out there looking, and we have, you know, using iNaturalist, they're trying to get people out there. So hopefully with more eyes on the streams, we can provide more data for um, for you to use. Are you using any
Excellent.
citizen science projects or anything?
You know, I look on Maryland Biodiversity Project every now and then, and there's some, you know, there's some things that I'm like, I got to go out there and see if that's there, and especially the acuminate crayfish. There's some records on there that I still need to check out, but that seem pretty reliable. You know what I mean? So, I mean, people out there looking, they're going to discover new things that we don't. We do a lot of surveys with the state, but we're not everywhere. We can't be everywhere. So it's really helpful to have all those interested folks working on it.
Well, I know I'm going to be looking, and I want to find one that is in berry, and I want to find
Yeah.
the little babies clinging on to the
Right. Right.
you know, that's going to be my goal for this season. So you've given me a goal to find when
That's
I'm
great.
out there in the streams. That's wonderful. Well, if there's
Remember,
no more,
remember, they cling on until the mom turns on and looks at them like they're food.
right,
So
right.
you know, I guess it's kind of like us when the kids are in college and we're like, okay, it's time for you to go. We're not going to eat you, but it's time for you to go. So,
Exactly. And I
but
agree. Alan says he could have listened to you for another hour, but
oh, it's nice.
yeah, this was
Thank
great,
you.
and I really appreciate you spending time with us to share information about Crayfish of Maryland. And thank you all for joining us for Must Learn Thursday. We'll see y'all again next week or in any of our programs or on the water or in the field or at the museum. There's always something going on to exercise your curiosity muscle with us here at the Natural History Society of Maryland. So, stay well, stay curious, stay outside, and if you're in Louisiana, get 3 to 5 pounds of crawfish. It's a good meal.
And Jay, that part about the mothers eating the babies, I was thinking that that's like putting the cray into crayfish. You know.
Right. Thank you all very much for listening. Appreciate it. It was fun.
Yeah. Thanks, Jay. We'll see you
Take
soon.
care.
All
All
right.
right.
Bye.
See y'all.